Hello, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Sally Farwell, President and CEO of the Achievement Centers for Children. It's an honor to be here today to partner with the City Club to introduce today's forum on rethinking autism. Today's forum is part of the City Club's Diversity Thought Leadership Series presented by KeyBank. Our speaker today is Clinical Assistant Professor at Ruth S. Ammon School of Education at Adelphi University, international speaker, author, and autism advocate, Dr. Stephen M. Shore. According to the Centers for Disease Control, autism and autism spectrum disorders are considered the fastest growing developmental disabilities. The prevalence of autism in American children increased by 119% from 2000 to 2010, and now affects an estimated 1 in every 66 births. As Dr. Shore will discuss today, individuals diagnosed with autism possess unique abilities, and if equipped with the proper tools, can enjoy successes in education and employment, leading to meaningful engagement in their community. Indeed, part of our goal today is to reframe how we think of autism. Rather than focusing on it as a disability, we can view autism as a set of unique abilities and skills. Our speaker today, Dr. Shore, has intimate knowledge of autism from both a clinical perspective and a personal one. He was diagnosed with atypical development and strong autistic tendencies as a child and was nonverbal until age 4. With advocacy and support from his parents, teachers, and others, Dr. Shore has become a professor at Adelphi University, where his research focuses on matching best practices to the needs of people with autism. Dr. Shore is also an author of several books on autism, including Beyond the Wall, Personal Experiences with Autism and Asperger's Syndrome, Ask and Tell, Self-Advocacy and Disclosure for People on the Autism Spectrum, and Understanding Autism for Dummies. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Stephen M. Shore.
Thanks for a wonderful introduction, and thank you to everybody for making it possible for me to join a long list of notable individuals who engage in the discourse that happens here at the City Club in Cleveland. It's an honor to be in front of so many people who have dedicated themselves to helping those with autism and other conditions to lead fulfilling and productive lives to our greatest potential. So a little bit about me. After 18 months of typical development, I was hit with what I call the autism bomb, otherwise known as regressive autism, where I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, withdrew from the environment, and in short, became a pretty significantly affected child on the autism spectrum. There was very little known about autism in those days. It took my parents a year to find a place for diagnosis, and when they did, the doctors said they had never seen a child who was so sick. Well, fortunately, my parents refuted those professionals' recommendations for institutionalization. They advocated on my behalf, just like we see so many parents doing today, and they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive, home-based early intervention program, emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. And that's just today's terminology. In those days, the concept of early intervention didn't exist. So that by the time age 4 rolled around, speech had begun to return. I was reevaluated by the school that initially rejected me. And instead of being considered as psychotic with strong autistic tendencies and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic, so things were looking better in the world. So what did my parents do? And it was mostly my mother. My father was there too, but in those days it was his job to hunt a saber-toothed tiger or a mastodon. And the mother stayed home and did mommy things. First, she tried to get me to imitate her. As you would expect a toddler to do, it didn't work. So then she flipped it around, and she began to imitate me. Once she did that, I became aware of her in my environment, and then we were able to move things along. I think the key implication is, before you do any good work with an individual on the autism spectrum, you have to develop a trusting relationship. Then you can move on. So whether you're an educator, a therapist, a parent, or anybody who's engaging with a person on the autism spectrum, you need to meet us where we are before moving on. And I think that holds true for everybody else as well, whether you have autism or not, whether you're dealing with a young toddler, or whether you're working with a postdoctoral student in a university. Age 4 is when my special interests began. At age 4, I was found in the kitchen taking apart a watch very much like this with a kitchen knife. I'd take out the hands, the gears, everything, and then put it back together again. The watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. My parents noticed this curious skill, and instead of being so concerned about what I couldn't do, the difficulties in verbal interaction, communication, and all of the other challenges that we face with autism, well, of course they were concerned about that, and they were doing what they could to help. They also recognized an ability, and soon there were all kinds of other devices to take apart and put back together. My parents made sure that I got them back together again. And I think that underlies the importance of parental involvement with individuals on the autism spectrum, perhaps with everybody else as well. So looking at my abilities, and as you mentioned a little bit earlier, the idea of looking at abilities as opposed to disabilities. I think what we need to do is we need to move from what I call a deficit model of autism. The first thing a parent hears when a child is diagnosed are all the things that that child won't be able to do, all the difficulties that they will have. That's a deficit model. Now, what if we look at those same characteristics using an abilities-based model? Let's transition to using an abilities-based model in looking at autism. So let's take an example. Let us suppose we have a hypothetical example of a young man with autism. He's very verbal, and he's got a fascination with trains, transportation system information, one of the most common special interests of those of us on the autism spectrum. And his job is to provide public transportation system information to lost patrons. So let's look at the common characteristics. One is communication. So often we hear about difficulties in communication, and certainly there are difficulties in communication. Some of us haven't developed a reliable means of communication yet. There are others who talk too much, and he's in that second category, especially when it comes to our special interests. However, if we think about the characteristics of communication of someone who might be considered to have Asperger's syndrome, the fact that we tend to be very direct, factual, detailed, data-driven, sometimes too truthful, repetitive. But then again, how many times have you asked someone to repeat directions when you're lost? So it works. What about social interaction? Typical social interaction can be challenging for us. Let's think about this particular job. A brief greeting, a request for directions. He's happy to provide those directions, and then goodbye. So that works. Now what about those special interests? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders refers to those interests as restricted interests, interests that become so intense that they can get in the way of and interfere with every aspect of life. That's a deficit model. What if we looked at it as an interest of such great intensity that it provides powerful motivation for completing curriculum in school, for exploring career choices? Well, in this case, this fellow who's fascinated with trains, he has got everything memorized. He can access the information needed much faster than his coworkers who have to look this information up in a reference. And strictly because this person has autism, he outperforms his coworkers who don't have autism. And this is how we need to take a look at the characteristics of autism. Because one characteristic that's often overlooked is the extremely widely varying skill set. And what that suggests is that the things we are good at, we're incredibly good at. The things that we're not so good at, it's really horrible. And we do still need to consider the challenges. I'm talking about strengths, I'm talking about abilities. However, I think everybody in this room will agree that there are significant challenges that come with being on the autism spectrum. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't be here trying to figure it out. But we also have to keep in mind, what are the strengths? So back to my situation. I entered regular school kindergarten at age 6. I was a social and academic catastrophe. You know what happens to those of us who are different in grade school? Fortunately, school systems are beginning to realize that bullying is not a developmental phase that people need to go through. Academically, I was about a grade behind in most of my subjects. Teachers didn't quite know how to reach me. However, I was very happy to go to school. You get the regular routine, the sameness, the scheduling. And I would go into the library and get books on my favorite subjects, whatever that was at that time. It might have been electricity, possibly aviation, maybe space exploration, earthquakes, weather, whatever it was. Get a big stack of books, read them all, take notes, copy diagrams. I remember at about age 8, I was sitting at my desk with a stack of astronomy books, and a teacher told me that I'd never learn how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math, maybe this much, so that I could teach statistics at the university level. I believe these days, and I've seen this, that more and more educators would notice this as a special interest. And let's get away from calling it a restricted interest, but maybe a special interest, a focused interest, a passion, a deep interest, and find a way to work that into the curriculum. Now, why did I get so much time to read these books? And sometimes I'd even wonder if there was more to school than just reading these books. Shouldn't I be doing math in groups or reading in groups or something? And I think what it translated to is that teachers didn't know how to reach me, but since I wasn't a behavior problem, they just sort of left me to my own devices, for better or for worse. And in this case, it was for better rather than for worse. However, we know much better now in education. And looking at the educational strategies and looking at accommodations that we develop for individuals on the autism spectrum, such as, for example, one really common accommodation is in the area of time. So often we throw extra time at a problem. The student needs more time. But often what I find is that the student with autism needs support in knowing how to manage their time, the executive function aspects of managing time. So maybe I would take that student aside when there's nobody else around during a break. We'd go to my desk and we'd lay out a time schedule for the intermediary parts of, say, a long-term assignment, such as a science paper, complete with the topic, the outline, getting the references, rough draft, final draft, all of those little pieces that most people have figured out on their own and are able to get together by the time the assignment is due. But for many people with autism, and many without autism, just kind of delay until the night before and you stay up all night and you get it done. So we set up this timeline for my student with autism, and once he has this timeline, he's got it all set, and he's very successful. However, my question is this something that could benefit the rest of the class? And maybe this handout should go to everybody, or at the very least, spend a lot of time in working out the intermediary deadlines. And in doing so, I'm taking what we might have considered as an expensive accommodation in terms of time, maybe resources, and integrating it into the teaching of the class. And in this way, looking at the accommodation, not as something we do for just a few people, but rather we do for everybody. And whenever I consider developing accommodations or modifications to curriculum, my question is, how can this benefit the rest of the class? And in this case, it does. However, I've only accessed 2 learning styles, visual and auditory. Well, let's make a good use of the bulletin boards that we have so often in class. And maybe I'd set up that bulletin board with 3, 4, or 5 columns, whatever the intermediary steps of developing this long-term assignment is. And as students finish, perhaps, the topic statement or find their resources, they turn them into me, I print them up in large font, put their name under it, and put it on the board. Students like seeing their work on the board. Principals like seeing bulletin boards full of student work when they walk around. So everybody benefits, and it visually provides for everybody in the class where they are in the process. But what about that student with autism? Guess who becomes the bulletin board monitor? It's that student, because they need more work in physically representing that, those steps in the process. And this person would be in charge of taking those printouts and putting them in the right column. And if they're unable to do that, I would provide them whatever support they needed, whether it was verbal, whether it was by demonstration, or even hand over hand so that they are successful. So in that way, providing that person more exposure, more experience to dealing with that change, and at the same time benefiting everybody in the class, and it's just part of my class. So in that way, I'm moving my curriculum towards universal design, and more people benefit from a single curriculum. And that's how I think about developing accommodations for individuals on the autism spectrum. So moving along, middle and high school. You don't need to have autism to have difficulties in middle and high school. But it was actually better for me because I was able to engage in my special interest. The silver lining in middle and high school is you start seeing courses, clubs, and activities based on particular interests. Music being an interest, I joined the band. Now I had a structured activity in which to mediate my interactions with other students. I got so interested in music that I would spend hours in the instrument closet, not only taking apart and putting the instruments back together, but also learning how to play them. So when I heard that one of the requirements for getting a degree in music education was to learn all the instruments, well, I was all over it. I was there. So I made it through grade school, then on to college. College was a utopia. I had more friends. If I wanted to ride my bicycle at midnight, I could find someone just as strange as I was to also ride at midnight. Dating occurs in college. Well, that was pretty confusing. Never could quite figure that out. I remember after spending a lot of time with this lady, it was in undergraduate school, she suddenly told me that she really likes hugs and back rubs. I think that has a particular meaning. What I thought was, I've got this brand new friend, and she doubles as a source of deep pressure, like a Temple Grandin squeeze machine. Because like many of us on the autism spectrum, I also crave deep pressure. I guess she had other ideas. So after a lot of conversation, I found out that she really wanted to be my girlfriend. I wasn't interested. We fast forward a little bit more. Now it's graduate school, spending a lot of time with this lady, initially reviewing each other's homework, then moving on to doing things socially. And then one day at a beach, she suddenly gave me a kiss, a hug, and held my hand. But by that time, I'd done the research. I'd read the books on body language, nonverbal communication, and relationships. And the sheer quantity of those books suggested to me that they probably just weren't written for people with autism. So now I got the social story down. If a woman hugs you, kisses you, and holds your hand all at about the same time, it probably means they want to be your girlfriend. If that's the case, you better have an answer right away. And it could either be yes, it could be no, or it could be further investigation and analysis is indicated. Well, it seemed to be a good thing to do. And we've been married for almost 25 years. Thank you. So relationships. Research suggests that those of us on the autism spectrum have the same needs, desires, wants, and diversity in relationships as the rest of the population. The challenge we face, though, is that we don't have a primary source of this information that most other people have, and that's typical age peers. The good news is that we have all of the techniques, materials, and concepts on how to teach this stuff. The challenge to society is that a lot of people get kind of squirrely talking about this stuff. So we got to get over that squirreliness, you might say. Other aspects of transition, and we're here talking about transition to adulthood in the areas of employment, in the areas of education. I started in the early years because transition starts when you know the person is on the autism spectrum. So this idea of transition starting at age 14 or 16, well, it's a good idea as long as you peel the one off and you're back to age 4 or 6, or whenever you find out. And I believe that by the time you get to age 14 or 16, that's when you're just finalizing things and you're figuring out what is going to be the situation with where that person is going to live, what are the employment possibilities, what are the educational possibilities. And you're preparing since day one, you might say. So since age 4, when I was taking apart watches, well, maybe I would have been a really good watchmaker or watch repairman had it been an earlier century. Now watches are mostly electronic and really boring inside, so much for that. Later on, I got interested in bicycles, and I got it to a point where I could take a bicycle apart down to the ball bearings and then put that back together again. And at a later time, during high school and college, that became a great way in which to raise money for tuition. I remember in high school working at a job that just didn't fit at all. It was working in a busy restaurant. Too much noise, too much commotion, too much sensory overload. It wasn't working. And it made me realize I need to find something else to do. Well, what was I interested in? Bicycles. So I got on my bicycle that I built from the ground up and made the rounds of the bicycle shops in the area. I'd find the manager and then start nerding into my bicycle with the manager, discussing all the little things about it that nobody else would know or care about to talk. And then after a while, I'd ask him for a job. It took 11 times, and then on the 12th time, I did get a job fixing bicycles. And that worked perfectly. I could regulate my sensory input. I could stay in the back of the store, fix bicycles, or come out to the front and help customers and talk about my favorite subject, which was bicycles. So that worked. Everybody on the autism spectrum who I know is successful has found a way to use their special interest in which to contribute to society as in employment. So often we think about Temple Grandin. She's probably the most well-known person on the autism spectrum. Her interest in cattle processing, where that interest comes from, we're not entirely sure, but she's really good at it. And those of you who ate the roast beef today, there's greater than a 50% chance that that beef was processed in a plant designed by Temple Grandin. And if we're able to match the interest and the strength to an area of employment, what we'll have is a person who may be a regional, national, or international expert in that area. So matching strengths to interests. And we're beginning to see that being done right now. There are organizations, the most recent being Microsoft, who are actively seeking people on the autism spectrum because they know many of us, not all, but a good number of us, are really good at IT-related subjects. And that's an example of using a strength. And we might have, for example, a person on the autism spectrum who can do in 15 hours out of a week what a person not on the autism spectrum takes an entire 40 hours of the week to get done. So that's an example of using strengths. And that said, why do we have to demand that that person be in the office for those full 40 hours if they can get it done in 15? And as we think about employment, as we think about accommodations and modifications for employment as well as education, what I'm finding is that modifications made tend to benefit everybody else as well. So as we think about some common ADA accommodations, access ramps, for example, to the front of the building. How many people with perfectly 2 good working legs walk up the ramp and not take the stairs? How grateful is the UPS deliverer with his loaded cart, hand truck of boxes, that he can just walk in the front of the building instead of having to drive all the way around to the back? So this is just one of many examples where an accommodation that was thought to be expensive, yeah, it was expensive, and that would benefit just a few people, end up benefiting society. In hotels, it's becoming more and more common for hotels to offer special rooms for people who have allergies, hypoallergenic rooms. They're super clean, they've got soft bedding, they often have a hardwood floor to eliminate the risk of airborne contaminants or particles that might be in the rug, and they tend to be quiet. But then the question is, wouldn't everybody like to have a quiet room with soft bedding that's free of dirt and dust and that has recently been deep cleaned? So that's an example of taking an accommodation but actually benefits the rest of society as well. And in business, a lot of those accommodations, whether they're visual schedules or visual means of communication that supplement verbal means of communication, everybody can benefit from that. And what we're finding is that hiring people on the autism spectrum is actually good business practice. If we get back to those characteristics and look at an abilities-based model, we tend to favor routines and predictability. It's the person with autism who shows up every day at work on time and makes sure that that job gets done, because that's the most important part of being employed for those of us on the spectrum. Get that job done. And that's what we'll do. And there are many situations, as I mentioned before with the example of that individual working in a busy train station. Due to the strengths and interest in that area, they're doing a better job than people who aren't on the autism spectrum. So it's a matter of focusing on strengths, focusing on abilities, and at the same time, being aware of those challenges and finding a way to work through those challenges. And the more we do for people on the autism spectrum, the better managers, if we happen to be managers or supervisors of businesses, will be. Those of us who are educators, if we can educate someone on the autism spectrum, we'll be a better educator overall. And the more inclusive we can be, the better off society will be. And these are some of the ideas that I have going through my mind when I think about promoting successful transition to adulthood. Thank you very much.
It's hard not to note that if you ask a person with autism to speak and you tell him he should stop at around 1 o'clock, stops at exactly 1 o'clock. Well done, sir. I'm Dan Multhrop. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are enjoying very much and nerding out on a Friday forum with Dr. Stephen Shore. That was your word, nerding. He is the clinical assistant professor at the Ruth S. Ammon School of Education at Adelphi University. We're going to get to our Q&A, and we encourage you to organize your questions for our speaker now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, which is our primary media partner, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. If you're listening to this live right now on WCPN, you're encouraged to tweet questions at the City Club or using the hashtag CityClub. We'll try to sneak them into the second half of the program. Television broadcasts and radio broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. You're invited to join us next Wednesday, April 22nd at noon as we welcome Joel Kotkin, Executive Director at the Center for Opportunity Urbanism, for a discussion on the resurgence of Rust Belt cities. For more information about any of our upcoming or past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is part of the Diversity Thought Leadership Series, sponsored by a generous gift for 11 years from Key Bank. We thank you very much for your support. And our community partner for today's program is the Achievement Centers for Children. We thank you very much for your support. And congratulations on your 75th anniversary. We welcome guests at the tables today hosted by the Achievement Centers, Key Bank, Koinonia Homes, and Medical Mutual. We thank you all very much for your support. And we also welcome students from St. Martin de Porres High School. Student participation at today's program is made possible by a grant from Medical Mutual. We thank you for your support. Will the students please stand to be recognized? Now we'd like to return to Dr. Stephen Shore for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphones today are City Club volunteer Spencer Kiesel and content associate Teddy Eisenberg. Can we have our first question, please?
It's tempting to ask you about some of the large statistical and demographic factors that the introduction touched on, why we would have such a rise in at least diagnosed autism spectrum disorder. That's really very puzzling. But I sense that and you're welcome to speak about it, but I sense that your great strength, thus I try to pay attention to it, is exactly the adaptation of your suite of abilities to the world around you. And you used a phrase which I have stumbled onto just a year or so ago, didn't really know it at all before, and it's executive function. This was in the case of talking about someone who's otherwise fine but has executive function disorder. And I wonder if you could say how much executive function, very high-level sorting among all the options that life gives you, how much is that something that you can learn to do? Is it very difficult to do? Is that a useful concept for you when you're trying to adapt to whatever your particular suite of abilities may be?
That's a very good question. Executive functioning, or thinking how we think about thinking and how we organize ourselves. And just like with the typical population, the abilities for us to engage in executive functioning vary widely. And for those of us who have challenges in this area, there are accommodations that can be made, whether it's something as simple as a mind map for trying to decode the meaning of a sentence, a paragraph, or a story, whether it's modeling. This is how you do it. A lot of times we need to be shown how to do something. And when we're shown how to do something and given practice on how to do it, that can be a great benefit. However, this can remain a major challenge, and is something that we address at Adelphi University for our about 100 students who are on the autism spectrum. Or I should more accurately say, about 100 students who are enrolled in our program that supports students who have Asperger's syndrome. And it is providing that assistance in executive functioning, whether it's maintaining your schedule, getting your homework in on time, interacting with others. It's these areas that can be so challenging for us, but when provided support, those of us on the autism spectrum can be very successful.
Hello. I have a 10-year-old son who has autism, and he hasn't quite figured out yet that he has it, but I think he's on the verge of it now. You know, he's starting to realize he gets pulled out for therapy sessions that the other kids don't, and that things are a little different for him. I just wanted to ask your suggestions on how do you guide someone through the awakening, through learning that, that they might, be a little different.
This is a very important question. How do you tell someone with autism they have autism? And I was lucky in this regard because my parents used the word autism in the house for as long as I can remember. So since about age 5.5, when my speech had pretty much normalized and I had enough cognition and self-awareness to make sense of the world around me, I knew I had this thing called autism. We didn't know much about what it was, but it certainly helped explain a lot of differences. However, I find many people don't learn about having autism that way. And I've developed a 4-step approach, which I find helpful, in which to inform someone that they're on the autism spectrum. So let's take an example. I started working with this child at age 5.5, giving him music lessons. He has Asperger's syndrome. His parents refuse to use the word autism in the house because they just know with enough intensive activity, we'd early interventionize the Asperger's syndrome right out of him. We fast forward to the teenage years. he still has Asperger's syndrome. And I'm also wondering, just like you, and your son is on the cusp of knowing, he knows that there's something different. And people on the autism spectrum, we know there's something going on, but how do we tell that person? Well, back to this example, teenage years, his parents decide, well, our son has to be told. And they asked me if I'd do the deed. I told them, well, it's a dirty job and Bruce Wayne ain't available. He's busy playing Batman. Well, we started the next session with step 1, which is getting to know your characteristics. We talked about his strengths in music, graphic design, and computers. We also talked about his challenges in making friends, penmanship, and physical education. And he got that pretty quickly. So we moved on to step 2, which is notating your strengths and challenges in a list. So we wrote the strengths down on one side, the challenges on another. And we decided that he was pretty good with computers, and why not just use your computer to write your papers instead of writing them by hand? And he thought that was a good idea. So there's 2 concepts at level 2. First, find a strength to accommodate for a challenge. We all do this anyways. Everybody does it. But for many of us on the autism spectrum, some things that we take for granted that people know need to be pointed out, need to be directly pointed out. So this is maybe one of the cases. The second concept is there's a word I haven't used yet since I've started talking. And that is when we talk about strengths, what do we so often talk about? Weakness. I don't use that word. I avoid it because weakness is a static word, has too many negative connotations. So often I think of what benefit we might have if we remove the word weakness in the strengths and weaknesses section of an IEP and replaced it with challenge. A challenge suggesting something we can work around, over, through, or maybe even just make a considered decision to ignore that challenge. So for example, I find that I'm pretty low functioning in a noisy bar. Too much social interaction, too much nonverbal communication, too much noise, too much smoke, and everything else. Now, I know that there are some interventions that I could engage in that might help with the hearing sensitivities. I could learn even more about nonverbal communication. Or I could just decide I can lead a fulfilling and productive life by not going into these establishments in the first place. So I just do that. That's making a considered decision to ignore a challenge. Well, now we're at step 3. Non-judgmental comparison. We take a look at strengths that other people have, challenges, his parents, friends, others that he knows, perhaps even some role models in society that we either know or think they might be on the autism spectrum. A lot of people think Bill Gates has autism, and he seemed to do okay with Microsoft. So that could be a possibility. So we got that down. And then step 4, presenting the label. And before I present the label, I talk about scientists and doctors who study people's characteristics. And it so happens to be that your set of characteristics line up with what is known as Asperger's syndrome. So we're about 20 minutes into it. That's where we were. He said, okay, enough of this. Let's get back to the lesson. He didn't want to hear anymore. Because it went by so fast, I wasn't sure if he got it. So I asked his father about 3 weeks later, how'd your son do with the disclosure? And his dad said, gee, my son, he loves having Asperger's syndrome. So he got it. And now he understands why he is the way he is. And with this greater understanding, this will help help your son be able to explain why he's so good at these things, maybe why he has challenges here. And this self-disclosure is a critical step to engaging in effective self-advocacy, which is another area that we need to teach those of us on the autism spectrum. Advocacy, effective self-advocacy. Advocacy takes place, or at least educationally takes place, during the grade school years. It's mandated by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Once that person ages out of school, all of those advocacy efforts are now on that person with a disability, on that person with autism. So they are the ones, for example, who have to be able to tell another person in a way that they can understand and provide support, what their needs are. So for example, you may think that this is a fashion statement. secondarily it is. I believe in supporting my university, Adelphi University, but at the same time, I have a pretty extreme visual sensitivity to recessed lighting. Standing under or sitting under a recessed lighting fixture is like looking into a spotlight for many other people. Here it is. So I may have to say in some situations, I know many people don't wear a hat at the office, in a restaurant, whatever the case may be. However, those lights really give me a headache. I must have sensitive eyes. So what I've done is I've engaged in a 3-step process of identifying the challenge in society or in my environment, lights. I've come up with my own accommodation, a reasonable accommodation. I've advocated for that accommodation, and I gave the reason why. So the advocacy is step 2, and then the reason why, or the disclosure, I have sensitive eyes. These lights give me a headache. So you have to give a reason if you're going to ask for greater understanding or a modification in the environment. And that's a vital part of successful transition to adulthood. Thanks.
You were diagnosed with autism at a point in time when there wasn't much known about the issue. So I'm wondering what kinds of experiences you've had beyond what you've shared already in elementary and secondary school. Were accommodations made? Were you included in the classroom? And what actually even happened when you were in undergraduate school around the issue of accommodations, if any?
All right, good question. Because what happened to those of us on the spectrum when there wasn't much known about it? Well, in those days, by the time age 6 came, I probably would have been considered as having high-functioning autism in that category because I was pretty much as verbal as the next person, but I was clueless about social interaction. Teachers didn't know anything about autism in those days. There was no special education law. And had they known then what they know today, I probably would have spent part of my time in a resource room and part of my time in an inclusion setting with a paraprofessional, but that didn't exist. So elementary school in particular was pretty messy. I didn't understand them. They didn't understand me. And fortunately, because I wasn't a behavior problem, teachers just left me to my own devices. And it was for better rather than for worse. By the time I got to middle and high school, that's when the special interest classes, clubs, activities kicked in, you might say. That's when we start seeing these types of courses. And I was able to find a way to engage, which also suggests the importance of the arts for people on the autism spectrum. So often, for students with autism and other conditions as well, the only place that they are successful is in one of the arts. It may be music, it may be drawing, whatever it might be, the arts. In college, there were no programs for people with autism in college. Fortunately, I was able to sort through most of my coursework and, you might say, self-accommodate for challenges that I had. So I knew I had a hard time taking notes, for example. That's pretty common for those of us on the autism spectrum. Switching attention back and forth between the lecturer, summarizing, writing it down, and trying to keep up with what that person is saying. So in those days in college, there was a note-taking service. I would buy notes. I would engage in study groups, share notes with other students, and in that way, I managed to get through.
Yeah. Hi, I'm a parent of a young adult with autism. I'm also the director of Milestones Autism Resources. And my question to you is about the parent involvement. And you talked about how important your own parents were. And as a parent and working with families, I see the importance of the involvement of the parents. And my question is about the loss. How is that impacting an adult with autism when they don't have the parents so engaged? And do you have advice in terms of creating a support team or a network once a student leaves school where they're used to having that whole IEP team? What's the next step for them? And what is your advice in terms of creating that help for the individual? Thank you.
You're welcome. And that is very important. There is no IEP team after graduation from grade school. So what that suggests is assembling people who can still provide support after graduation and be able to extend that support into, if this person is going to university level, at the university or employment, in the community, or in residential. And the key is to build a team. Because if you ask one person to do it, like a parent does, and imagine if you had to write out the job description of a parent. If you're a parent of a child on the spectrum, what would your job description be? How long would it take to write that out? And what would any person do if you said, gee, can you help me with this? Here's what my child needs for support. Everybody's going to run screaming in the other direction. But we can divide this up, and we can engage people who have ability and interest in particular areas. Can we find a person who might be able to help with the educational aspects, if that is where the person is going? Can we find somebody else who can help with the employment aspects, or whatever the needs of that person may be? So it's about building a network and a community along the way, just like as an important part of transitioning to adulthood. This way.
Yes, Dr. Shore, thank you for what you do for persons with autism as a parent and as a practitioner for treating persons with autism. And thank you for being on the advisory board of the U.S. Autism and Asperger Association for self-advocacy. This is another one of the many things you do. We're on the board. I'm on the medical end. So can you compare and contrast medical versus behavioral treatments and options for children and adults of people with autism and Asperger's?
I sure can. And it's an important question because so often I see an artificial divide between education and medical. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that if a person with autism has medical needs, then it has to be for medical reasons. Sometimes I see doctors saying, well, we can't treat this digestive issue or this immunological issue because the person has autism and that's just the way it is. So if a person with autism is in need of medication, and many of us are, I haven't had a need for any medication related to autism or medication beyond having a flu and needing to take antibiotics. However, I know many people on the autism spectrum who do need medication. They do need supplements. And without this medication or supplements, they're just total disaster areas. So it's a matter of finding a competent medical professional, just like Dr. DeMayo over here, who understands autism and understands the effects and potential effects of medication for people on the autism spectrum. And to this point, at least as far as I know, maybe Dr. DeMayo knows better than I, because I am a doctor, but not that type of doctor. I'm an education doctor. As far as I know, there isn't any medication for autism. Medication doesn't alter the core characteristics of autism. But there's an awful lot, there are many aspects of autism and co-occurring conditions, such as depression, such as anxiety, and various others, that can really be helped with medication under the care of a competent medical professional. So what I would like to see, and what I challenge us educators, therapists, parents, and medical professionals, is to find way to engage in greater collaboration and in talking with each other. And a lot of that does happen in the USAAA conferences that occur every year.
Doctor, actually following up on that collaboration, with the rise in autism, particularly in Cleveland, I'm sure around the country as well, there's been the growth of many places that have directed their forces toward autism. The Achievement Centers has directed a great amount of their resources toward autism. There's other organizations. There's various different things. And what I've seen from my work and assistance with autism is that they oftentimes don't come together, and they're working in different places on it, and there's no cohesive direction to it. And so how would you suggest that those groups, those organizations, come together better to direct the person with autism?
These groups or a representative of these groups need to talk to each other. And that challenge I found as I did my research in comparing educational approaches for individuals with autism. So I talked to key developers of applied behavior analysis, of TEACH, floor time, daily life therapy, Miller Method, and some others. And I found that the developers of these approaches were doing very little interaction and very little communication between each other. So I think what we need to do is keep in mind what the focus is. And the focus should be, I believe, is doing what's best for that individual on the autism spectrum and matching best practice, whether it's education, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's medical, whatever it might be, matching those practices to individual needs.
Hi, I'd like to thank you, first of all, for stating so clearly that it's not just about inclusion, it's about how we include. And that is so often the missing piece in dealing with our children and these individuals with autism in society. I'm the mother of a son with autism, and I have 2 other children. My goal for my son with autism has been the same as my other children for their adult life: to be happy, healthy, and a contributing member of society. What suggestions do you have for motivating companies out there to really open up those inclusion barriers and give these children a chance? How can we motivate the competitive job market to meet these individuals with their specialized needs?
We can convince the competitive job market by educating the competitive job market with, or through, or in collaboration of organizations such as Specialist Stern, which focuses on employing people with autism in IT. Now, that organization was founded by a father. It always takes a parent. Founded by a father of a child with autism, and his question was, what can my geeky son do when he grows up? And he's gotten it to a point where he set himself a goal of providing 1 million jobs around the world for people with autism in IT. And what he does is he collaborates with organizations such as SAP, such as Microsoft, and many others internationally in promoting the strengths of those individuals with autism and what contributions they can make, and demonstrating to these companies and people who run them that making your workplace open and available to people with autism and developing accommodations and modifications is actually good business practice. So developing flexibilities in how people communicate, developing flexibility perhaps in scheduling, we see that as flex time, that may be helpful to somebody with autism, as with everybody else, is really just good business practice. And what I'm seeing these days is that we're transitioning from a manufacturing society. Actually, it's pretty much transitioned from. And a manufacturing society requires all their workers to be the same, to do the same thing, and to be trained in a uniform way. These days, we're more in an innovation society, coming up with ideas. And it's those who are on the outliers who are doing the innovation. And it's those with autism who tend to be outliers. So, for example, if we think way back to the caveman days, where everybody was sitting around the campfire socializing and yakking at each other about the weather and who knows what, maybe it was that caveman or cavewoman who was less interested in socializing and going outside to see if they could figure out how to start a fire the way lightning does. And maybe if we didn't have people on the autism spectrum, we'd still be sitting around campfires and throwing spears at each other.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum featuring Dr. Stephen M. Shore, Clinical Assistant Professor at the Ruth S. Ammon School of Education at Adelphi University. Thank you, Dr. Shore. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.